In between the years of 1913 and 1930, renowned Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote a number of books that was compiled into what is now called the Red Book. The Red Book was kicked off by a series of visions he had before the outbreak of World War I that he later came to the conclusion foretold the Great War. For example, one time he had a vision of Europe being devastated by a catastrophic flood, then a vision of rivers of blood across Europe, an image of a dead hero, his soul asking him if he will accept war and destruction, being in a foreign land and needing to quickly return home by ship, which actually ended up happening, and so on and so forth. For example, he recounts one of the visions in the Red Book. It happened in October of the year 1913 as I was leaving alone for a journey, that during the day I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. It reached from England up to Russia and from the coast of the North Sea right up to the Alps. I saw yellow waves swimming rubble and the death of countless thousands. This vision lasted for 2 hours, it confused me and made me ill. I was not able to interpret it. 2 weeks passed before then the vision returned, still more violent than before. Later he concludes, because I carried the war in me, I foresaw it. Initially, Jung thought that he was going crazy for having this vision that he couldn't interpret, and of course later he came to think it was a prophecy, as he wrote in a letter to Romanian historian Mircea Eliade. I learned from the newspapers that war had broken out. Finally I understood, and when I disembarked in Holland on the next day, nobody was happier than I. Now I was sure that no schizophrenia was threatening me. I understood that my dreams and my visions came to me from the subsoil of the collective unconscious. In the foreword of this book, the author who wrote it proposes this idea that artists of the time sometimes have a sense for what is to come, and they portend it through their artwork. So in 1913, because of these visions, Jung began a self-experiment, what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. He developed a technique for inducing visions, which seems to sound a little bit consistent with maybe hypnagogic hallucinations, maybe lucid dreaming, possibly even what people refer to as astral projection. He described you use only the retina of the eye at first in order to objectify. Then instead of keeping on trying to force the image out, you just want to look in. Now when you see these images, you want to hold them and see where they take you, how they change, and you want to try to get into the picture yourself to become one of the actors. I kind of know what he means because I've had sort of strange visions like this take over me sometimes during hypnagogic states when I'm about to fall asleep. A materialist would view them as just, the brain doing weird things, organizing, cleaning itself out, whereas a spiritualist would say that is where the veil is thinnest between this realm and other realms. And therefore, that's when you're better able to access, say, the collective unconscious. So Jung began to very purposefully induce these visions in order to get to the bottom of his inner processes, to translate the emotions into images, to grasp the fantasies which were stirring underground, and he later called this technique active imagination. Now, I had always heard that the Red Book was the book Jung wrote when he descended into a period of psychosis, that he was somewhat detached from reality at this time. But it turns out that's not quite accurate. For starters, he had every intention to publish the Red Book, though he ultimately decided not to, and as you'll see, he ends the epilogue mid-sentence. But this wasn't some deeply private thing that he was trying to hide from the world. This was something that he showed to many people in his life and was considering publishing. For Jung, this was not a descent into madness. He was still able to function in everyday life, and he went into these visions intentionally. To him, that was the distinction between psychosis and active imagination, the intentionality of it. But of course, many intellectuals, particularly rationalist intellectuals who came after Jung, probably read the book and thought, this is insane, this guy must have been off his rocker to write these things. Well, I read the Red Book, and today I'm going to tell you my own impression and main takeaways from it. Because it's not every day that we get to see the deepest, darkest recesses of one of the most brilliant thinkers in history. So the first thing you have to understand is that back in the time when Jung wrote this, self-experimentation and introspection were used to gain psychological insight. They were considered a form of science. And this brings up a really interesting question of, can truth be found not just in quantitative studies of the external world, but also in qualitative studies of the internal world? Jung's scientific question was to see what took place when he switched off his consciousness. He also wanted to better understand and integrate the different parts of his personality and to understand the relationship between the individual and the collective unconscious, and to better understand symbols, particularly Christian ones. So what is actually in the Red Book? A lot of it seems to be Jung basically describing a sort of spiritual descent into hell, or the underworld of his mind. You may know that in Jungian psychology, the underworld or the hell is considered a metaphor for the unconscious. And in a sense, most of this book is Jung diving into the unconscious, specifically the collective unconscious, which I'll clarify what that is in just a second. A lot of the book is also just a dialogue between himself and what he calls his soul. For example, he says, "Hence I had to speak to my soul as to something far off and unknown, which did not exist through me, but through whom I existed." He often speaks quite intimately with his soul, affectionately. "How strange it sounds to me to call you a child, you who still hold the all without end in your hand. I went on the way of the day, and you went invisibly with me, putting the pieces together meaningfully and letting me see the whole in each part." Other times, he speaks to his soul more mistrustfully. "I should give myself completely into your hands, but who are you? I do not trust you." Other times, quite violently. "You rise against me? I am screwing the vise tighter, that's all. I will break your bones until there is no longer a trace of hardness there. For I want to get along with you. I must. Damn you. You are my eye, which I must carry around with me to the grave. Do you think that I want to have such foolishness around me all my life? If you were not my eye, I would have torn you to pieces long ago." So you can sort of see how a very empirical rationalist might hear all these mixed emotions he's expressing towards ultimately himself and assume that he was just psychotic when he wrote them. But I find that what he says actually makes perfect sense, because sometimes we love parts of ourselves, other times we mistrust them, other times we hate them and we have violent thoughts about parts of us. There's nothing inherently pathological about communicating and dramatizing that. And in fact, Jung even encouraged his own patients to do the same, to maybe write their own red books. And it got me thinking, would I ever do something like this? Yeah, I feel like I would if I had the time. I would intentionally go into hypnagogic hallucinations and write down what I thought, because that sounds deeply introspective and interesting. And there does feel like there is something of value there. We so often look to the external world for answers on what is the meaning of it all. But what if some of the answers are within us? So the book contains a lot of biblical excerpts interspersed at the beginnings of chapters. A lot of biblical characters show up in his visions, like Elijah, Salome, the devil, who in one vision is depicted as a red horseman. Sometimes there are also ghosts and dead people that make an appearance. For example, several weeks later, 3 shades approached me. I noticed from their chilly breath that they were dead. The first figure was that of a woman. She drew near and made a soft whirring sound, the whirring of the wings of the sun beetle. Then I recognized her. When she was still alive, she recovered the mysteries of the Egyptians for me, the red sun disk and the song of the golden wings. The Red Book is also highly literary and esoteric. From endless blur plains, you sink into black depths. Luminous fish draw you, marvelous branches twine around you from above. You slip through columns and twisting, wavering, dark-leaved plants, and the sea takes you up again in bright green water to white sandy coasts, and a wave foams you ashore and swallows you back again, and a wide smooth swell lifts you softly and leads you again to new regions, to twisting plants, to slowly creeping slimy polyps, and to green water and white sand and breaking surf. Sometimes there are poems interspersed there. In the appendices, there are also sketches of mandalas, which Jung believed the mandala was a symbol for the individuated self. Initially, when I first started reading this book, I was kind of disappointed with myself because I couldn't intellectually analyze what he was saying. But then I realized that would be like somebody trying to intellectualize a fever dream stream of consciousness that I made. Maybe this isn't a work that's meant to be scrutinized through a scientific lens, but rather through a quasi-artistic lens. So what is Jung's personal hell like? What was his underworld depicted as? A lot of it takes place in a desert. 6th night, my soul leads me into the desert of my own self. I did not think that my soul is a desert, a barren, hot desert, dusty and without drink. Why is myself a desert? Have I lived too much outside of myself in men and events? Hot, dry air flowed around me, and I saw the desert, yellow sand all around, heaped up in waves, a terrible irascible sun, a sky as blue as tarnished steel, the air shimmering above the earth. On my right side, a deeply cut valley with a dry riverbed, some languid grass, and dusty brambles. His theory about why his hell is a desert? In the desert, the solitary is relieved of care and therefore turns his whole life to the sprouting garden of his soul, which can flourish only under a hot sun. In his garden, the delicious red fruit grows that bears swelling sweetness under a tight skin. As we'll talk about more in a second, Jung's entire philosophy on life is on integrating the complementary nature of opposites. And so if you are heading inwards to look at the riches within your spiritual world, it makes sense that the outward environment in your vision is a dry, barren desert. But not all of his encounters in the collective unconscious take place in this personal hell. There are other similarly gorgeous descriptions of different parts of the collective unconscious. I see a gray rock face along which I sink into great depths. I stand in black dirt up to my ankles in a dark cave. Shadows sweep over me. I am seized by fear, but I know I must go in. I crawl through a narrow crack in the rock and reach an inner cave whose bottom is covered with black water. Caves are also associated with the unconscious in Jungian symbolism, and it sure sounded to me like astral projection to sort of fall into the vision. There's also so much serpent symbolism in the Red Book. There I see, and a terror seizes me, curled up serpents on the dark rock walls, striving toward the depths where the sun shines. 1,000 serpents crowd around, veiling the sun. Deep night falls. A red stream of blood, thick red blood, springs up, surging for a long time, then ebbing. I am seized by fear. I thought this one in particular was interesting because caves, blood, and serpents all sound very consistent with a goddess fertility cult. And Jung's symbolism is oftentimes interpreted through a very Christian worldview, but sometimes his visions feel pre-Christian rather than Christian. The depths would like to devour you whole and choke you in mud. He who journeys to hell also becomes hell. Therefore do not forget from whence you come. The depths are stronger than us. Hell is when the depths come to you with all that you no longer are or are not yet capable of. Hell is when you can no longer attain what you could attain. Hell is when you must think and feel and do everything that you know you do not want. Hell is when you know that your having to do is also a wanting to, and that you yourself are responsible for it. Hell is when you know that everything serious that you planned with yourself is also laughable, that everything fine is also brutal, that everything good is also bad, that everything high is also low, and that everything pleasant is also shameful. But the deepest hell is when you realize that hell is also no hell, but a cheerful heaven. Not a heaven in itself, but in this respect a heaven, and in that respect a hell. Again, here we hear this like duality between heaven and hell, and how they're kind of two sides of the same coin. The walls enlarge into a huge mountain, and I see that I am below on the foundation of the crater in the underworld, and that I stand before the house of the prophet. I am walking alone in a dark forest, and I notice that I have lost my way. And the following night, I found myself wandering once more in a homely, snow-covered country. A gray evening sky covers the sun. The air is moist and frosty. On the following night, I wandered to the northern land and found myself under a gray sky in misty, hazy, cool, moist air. The trees become sparse, white swamp meadows accompany the still, murky water. The horizon is unending and lonely, draped by gray clouds. At times, his underworld is also quite violent. Like one time, he has a vision that his soul is showing him a dead girl and he makes him eat her liver, a sort of form of symbolic cannibalism. Now, the hell that I described and all the other places within this world that he inhabited in his visions could be interpreted as belonging to the collective unconscious. What is the collective unconscious? Well, Freud believed that the mind is split up into conscious and unconscious, but Jung came along and he said, actually, the unconscious is also split up into two parts as well. The personal conscious, which pertains to that particular person, and the collective unconscious that we all share, all of humanity. And to Jung, there were two parts to every person, the one who lived in the present and the one who was connected to all of history. And in fact, he had parts of his personality that he thought were somehow connected to the ages, that maybe came from the 17th century or the Middle Ages, that felt a lot more ancient than him. And according to him, the collective unconscious communicates through what's called primordial images. Myths, symbols, all of these are very much shown in the narrations of his visions, which are highly symbolic and literary and feel more like a work of fiction, because in a sense, all fiction is the collective unconscious coming to communicate with us symbolic manners and sort of transmute them into language. Now, Jung thought that the collective unconscious could become activated in one of two ways. One is through a personal crisis or a collapse of one's hopes and expectations, and another one is during times of great social, political, or religious upheaval, when highly intuitive people could translate their visions from the unconscious into communicable forms. And he said if the collective unconscious replaces reality and the person loses control, then it becomes pathological, then it becomes psychosis. And in fact, he did think that people with schizophrenia, for instance, were at the mercy of the collective unconscious. At times, I found myself wondering if he was describing what in New Age circles is sometimes called the one giant consciousness. As a drop in the ocean, you take part in the current, ebb and flow. You swell slowly on the land and slowly sink back again in interminably slow breaths. You wander vast distances in blurred currents and wash up on strange shores, not knowing how you got there. You mount the billows of huge storms and are swept back again into the depths. You saw that it was the life of the whole and the death of each individual. You felt yourself entwined in the collective death, from death to the earth's deepest place, from death in your own strangely breathing depths. We see here the uniqueness of each individual contrasted with the all one unconscious that we are also a part of. That is something that sometimes in spiritualist circles people talk about. The idea that yes, we have our one individual consciousness, but after death, and maybe perhaps during the collective unconscious experiences too, we become a part of the greater ocean of consciousness. We become just a drop of water in something that's much greater than us, where we don't exist as individuals. Also, I found that much of the book seems to be about integrating duality, sort of integrating these complementary opposites. There's this idea that everything has a shadow, right? When the sun's shining on an object, there will be a shadow. So where there is light, there will be shadow. And he says, the image of God has a shadow that is just as great as itself. I myself am a murdered and murdered, sacrifice and sacrificed. You, man, should not seek the feminine in women, but seek and recognize it in yourself, as you possess it from the beginning. This is essentially the first few seeds of what later became his concept of the anima, which is the feminine unconscious self of men. Then he goes on to say, you, woman, should not seek the masculine in men, but assume the masculine in yourself since you possess it from the beginning. So this is the equivalent of the animus, the woman's unconscious masculine side. We need the coldness of death to see clearly. Life wants to live and to die, to begin and to end. You are not forced to live eternally, but you can also die since there is a will in you for both. Life and death must strike a balance in your existence. Today's men need a large slice of death since too much incorrectness lives in them, and too much correctness died in them. What stays in balance is correct, what disturbs balance is incorrect. So we hear this idea of balance between the two opposites, between the pendulum swings. Because I wanted to give birth to my God, I also wanted evil. He who wants to create an eternal fullness will also create eternal emptiness. You cannot undertake one without the other. If I accept the lowest in me, I lower a seed into the ground of hell. The seed is invisibly small, but the tree of my life grows from it and conjoins the below with the above. At both ends there is fire and blazing embers. The above is fiery and the below is fiery. Between the unbearable fires grows your life. You hang between these two poles. He sees the tree of life, whose roots reach into hell and whose top touches heaven. This sounds very reminiscent of what he later wrote in the 1951 quote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down from hell." You see how a lot of his later concepts and quotes seem to have originated from the visions that he described in this book. And so in a sense, if you think that some of what Jung had to say was of value and of psychological insight, you must admit that looking inward and having these sort of spiritual experiences can bring great value. Christ sent what is beneath to hell since it strives toward the good. That had to be, but the separated cannot remain separated forever. It will be united again. Because we know that too far into the good means the same as too far into evil, we keep them both together. How holy, how sinful, how everything hot and cold flows into one another. Madness and reason want to be married, the lamb and the wolf graze peacefully side by side. It is all yes and no. The opposites embrace each other, see eye to eye and intermingle. They recognize their oneness in agonizing pleasure. My heart is filled with wild battle. The waves of dark and bright rivers rush together, one crashing over the other. How will it be now that God and the devil have become one? Are they in agreement to bring life to a standstill? Does the conflict of opposites belong to the inescapable conditions of life? And does he who recognizes and lives the unity of opposites stand still? It is difficult to unite hate and love, yet you know that it is the same. Hate and love mean the same to me. I begin with nothingness. Nothingness is the same as the fullness. In infinity, full is as good as empty. Nothingness is empty and full. You might just as well say anything else about nothingness, for instance, that it is white or black, or that it does not exist, or that it exists. That which is endless and eternal has no qualities, since it has all qualities. So these are just many, many examples of this nature of everything is inextricable from its opposite. Fullness, oneness consists of the integration of these polar opposites. Now, I also want to talk about one more concept from Jungian psychology that we do see brought up in the Red Book, and that is the concept of the shadow. The devil is the sum of the darkness of human nature. He who lives in the light strives toward being the image of God. He who lives in the dark strives toward being the image of the devil. Because I wanted to live in the light, the sun went out for me when I touched the depths. So diving into hell was like, for him, getting in touch with his shadow self, as well as with the collective unconscious. The shadow self, if you're not familiar in Jungian psychology, the parts of us that we completely reject, everything that we want not to be, everything ego dystonic. Now, let me read you a quick little excerpt, and I want you to think about, who do you think he's talking to in this excerpt? Did you feel dejected today, inferior, debased? Shall I tell you why? Your inordinate ambition is boundless. Your grounds are not focused on the good of the matter, but on your own honor. You do not work for humanity, but for your self-interest. You do not strive for the completion of the thing, but for the general recognition and safeguarding of your own advantage. You speak skillfully and abuse your capability and discolor, tone down, strengthen, apportion light and shade, and loudly proclaim your honorableness and upright good faith. You exploit the good faith of others, you gloatingly catch them in your snares, and speak of your benevolent superiority and the prize that you are for others. You play at modesty and do not mention your merit in the certain hope that someone else will do it for you. You are disappointed and withdraw hurt if this doesn't happen. You preach hypocritical composure, but when it really matters, are you calm? No, you lie. You consume yourself in rage, and your tongue speaks cold daggers, and you dream of revenge. You are gloating and resentful. You are envious of all well-being around you, and you impertinently assert the opposite. Who do you think he's talking to in this excerpt? He wrote this on the day that he resigned as president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, which to me sounds like probably he was feeling some sort of shame about something. When I read this page, I jotted down, it sounds like he's speaking to himself, quite some self-loathing. And I remember thinking, is this his shadow self he's talking to? The reason I thought this is because this sounds eerily familiar to dialogues I've had with my own shadow. Moments in my life when I've just been like, you are such a fucking piece of shit. Like, this is everything I hate about you. This is everything that you want people not to know about you that is literally so disgusting. That's what it sounded like to me. And then a couple pages later in the footnotes, author says, Jung later described the self-criticism depicted in this opening section as the confrontation with the shadow. This was him encountering his shadow self. I find that to be really fascinating, that we can see in the Red Book the moment that he actually came face to face with his shadow and sort of was stripped of all his defenses and saw the deepest recesses of his psyche that he wants to entirely reject about himself. Also, throughout the book, there sometimes is this tension depicted between empiricism and mysticism. In one chapter, Jung goes in one of his visions to a magician to ask to be taught in the ways of the dark arts. And the magician tells him it cannot be taught, it's purely irrational. He calls science a poison that Jung drinks from every day. And this is really interesting because I think there are these two parts of Jung that sort of battled it out his whole life. The part that was drawn to psychology and empiricism and science, and the part that was drawn to mysticism and spirituality and philosophy and religion. And I think that his persona was very much allied with the empirical part of him, but there is no doubt in my mind, especially after reading this book, that he was a deeply mystical man, and he was in touch with that as well. A lot of the reflections in the Red Book seem to have inspired the origins of various concepts in Jungian psychology, such as, like I said, the anima or the animus, personality types. There are parts where he talks about how some people are feeling and some people are more thinking, which kind of became the basis of his personality types proposition. And of course, the collective unconscious, the shadow self. Some of these concepts, there were little seedlings before the Red Book, but some of them were kind of fully confronted in the Red Book. So why did he never finish the Red Book? Jung tells us his interest in alchemy took him away from it in 1930. In 1959, he actually started an epilogue when he was considering publishing it. Here's some of what he says there. I worked on this book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. There, the contents of this book found their way into actuality, and I could no longer continue working on it. To the superficial observer, it will appear like madness. It also would have developed into one, had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. With the help of alchemy, I could finally arrange them into a whole. And then the epilogue is unfinished, mid-sentence. I knew how frightfully inadequate this undertaking was, but despite much work and many distractions, I remained true to it, even if another possibility never. And 2 years later, in 1961, he died. So there you have it. There is the very open-ended ending of the Red Book. Those were sort of the main beats that I took away from it. I'd be really curious your own thoughts. I assume many of you have not read the Red Book, but if you have, I definitely want to hear what you think about it, or just what you think about what I've mentioned in this video. Are these the ravings of a man who lost himself in mysticism, or is there something of psychological value here? And would you ever do something like this yourself? Would you ever practice active imagination and write your own Red Book? Let me know. Hope you take care and see you soon.